Millionaire told his son to choose a new mom among the rich, but he chose the Maid. She was invisible to everyone but him. In a world obsessed with wealth, appearances, and status, a little boy's choice revealed a truth no fortune could ever buy. What began as an arrangement rooted in prejudice turned into a life-changing moment that no one saw coming. Hey friends, welcome back to Cracks of Light. Here we share powerful, heart-touching stories that remind us kindness, courage, and hope are still alive in the world. If you want to help us bring more of these meaningful stories to life, please hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Your support gives us the motivation to keep sharing light with the world. This inspirational story takes you deep inside the walls of privilege, where a grieving child is told to select a perfect new mother from women of power and influence. But while the mansion buzzes with pride and ego, the boy sees something no one else notices: the quiet strength, kindness, and resilience of someone everyone underestimated. Grace leaves the marble foyer with the window cloth still in her hand, the smell of glass cleaner clinging to her sleeve. A convoy of spotless SUVs has just rolled past the lilacs and parked in a neat row along the circular drive. From the kitchen archway, Martha called her back. "Stay in the service hall today, honey." But Grace saw the empty patio and the little stack of lake pebbles knocked over like a toppled tower, and she knows where the boy goes when he needs to vanish. The backwoods are a cool hush behind the Whitmore estate, the kind of quiet that makes every breath sound too loud. Down a narrow mulch path, dragonflies skim a thread of water, and the old footbridge makes its small wooden shape over the creek. Grace spots a scuffed sneaker first, then a pair of knees drawn tight to a chest, then Ethan's face, half-shadowed under the slats. She crouches, palms open on the damp boards. "Hey, buddy." He startles, then exhales when he recognizes her. He doesn't crawl out. That's okay. She lowers herself to sit, spine against the railing, letting her shoes dangle over the water. The current isn't even a current, just a long breath under maple leaves. "I figured you'd be here," she says softly. "Your pebbles were on the patio. Looked like they missed you." He shrugs without looking up. The creek says more than he does. "Want to tell me what happened?" Ethan's voice is flat, scraped thin from holding back. "Dad says 5 ladies are coming. I'm supposed to pick one to be my mom." Grace stays quiet long enough for the wood to creak beneath them. That's a lot to put on 9-year-old shoulders. He presses his forehead to his knees. "I already have a mom." "I know. She's not here," he says, and the words trip, rush, spill. "But I don't want a replacement. They don't even know me." Grace lets the breeze speak for a beat. Sunlight freckle paints the creek, breaking the shade into coins. "Your mom loved you with her whole heart, Ethan. That kind of love doesn't vanish because someone isn't in the room. It stays in how you love and in what you remember. It stays in the way you talk about her and the way you feel safe." He steals a look at her. There's a long searching in the glance, like he's checking a map only he can read. "They're just here because of my dad," he says. "Because of the house, the cars. I can't speak for them," Grace answers. "Honest, I can only speak for me." Ethan studies her a second longer, something fierce and old beyond his years. "You're the only person here who actually cares about me." The sentence lands between them like a small flag at the top of a hard climb. Grace wants to hug him, wants to lift the bridge off its posts and carry it on her back if that would help, but she keeps her hands folded. "I care a lot," she says. "Sometimes caring looks like cleaning up a kitchen, and sometimes it looks like sitting under a bridge long enough for the feelings to calm down." His mouth twitches into the ghost of a smile. "Martha said I was being dramatic. You're being honest. That's different. She also said I was rude to leave." Grace tips her head. "Maybe. But I think your legs brought you where your heart needed you. We can work on the manners later." "I don't want to go back," he says, barely above the sound of water. "I know. I don't want to see them." "I know." He picks at a splinter in the railing. "Will you stay if they make me pick?" Her throat tightens. She's a housekeeper, not a parent, not family. She was hired to polish surfaces, to keep the machine humming. And yet here, beneath boards that smell like rain, she's been more than a pair of hands. "I can't promise what I don't control," she says carefully. "But I can promise this. I won't let you feel alone while I'm here. Not if I can help it." The wind shifts. A man's voice ricochets through the trees, powerful and impatient, bouncing off leaves and water. Ethan. Ethan flinches. He looks at Grace like a swimmer checking the shore, and then, like he's choosing, he crawls out from under the bridge. Grace stands and dusts off the seat of her jeans. He slides his hand into hers for one step, just one, then lets go and squares his shoulders. They take the path back, the sun hotter on the open lawn, the estate rising like a polished promise beyond the hedges. On the patio, the pebbles are still scattered, like the beginning of a language no one finished writing. Ethan stoops and scoops two into his pocket. "You ready?" Grace asks. "No," he says. "But I'm going." When they round the corner of clipped boxwoods, the tableau could be a magazine spread. 5 women staged across the flagstones with perfect posture and practiced smiles. Dresses in summer hues ripple faintly in the breeze. Cold brew sweats in a pitcher. A tray of petit fours gleams beneath cellophane. David Whitmore stands beside them, immaculate in a navy blazer at 3 in the afternoon, phone tucked away for once. His jaw is tense, even from a distance. "Ethan," he calls again, softer now that the audience is in view. "Come here, please." Ethan walks forward, not fast. Grace keeps a respectful distance behind him, off to the side, where household staff live, adjacent to everything, central to nothing. Martha watches from the kitchen door, apron on, hands knit tight at her waist. David spreads a hand as though unveiling a product. "These are friends, son. I want you to meet." Ethan stops in the center of the patio, right where the sun makes a bright square on the stone. He doesn't look at the women first. He looks at Grace, then at his father. The little pebbles in his pocket clack softly when he straightens his back. "If you want me to choose," Ethan says, the words surprisingly clear for a voice that has been so small, "then I will." David exhales relieved, ready to pivot into introductions. Ethan lifts his chin. "If I have to choose, I choose Grace." It isn't a shout. It's too calm to be called a scene. It's just truth said out loud, which has a way of sounding louder than anything. The patio freezes. Someone inhales sharply through her teeth. The cellophane over the petit fours gives a brittle little crack. One of the women's smiles collapses into an O. Another's eyes flick across the terrace, calculating exits. Martha's hand flies to her mouth. David's face drains, then floods. Grace feels the heat in her cheeks as if she's the one who stepped into sunlight after too long indoors. She does not move. She does not say a word. The last thing Ethan needs is her voice. He needs her steadiness. "What did you just say?" David asks, each word trimmed to a blade. Ethan moves his hand toward the space where Grace stands, not quite pointing, just naming his north. "You heard me." One of the guests tucks her hair behind a diamonded ear and laughs a small, airy laugh meant to puncture tension. "Oh, sweetie, that's adorable." Ethan's eyes flash. It's not adorable. David's posture shifts a half-inch closer, blazer pulling at the shoulder. "Ethan, that's enough." "It isn't," Ethan replies, and for a heartbeat, he looks 9 and 50 at the same time. "You want someone who looks right. I want someone who makes it feel right." "Grace works for us," David says, turning to the women, apology swarming his features. "She's valued help." Grace swallows around the gravel in her throat. Help is a word that can mean 1,000 things and nothing at all. Ethan shakes his head. "She's the only one who knows me." The first murmur drifts across the patio, the fragile whisper of money meeting a mess. Grace feels the ground tilt. She stands it. She keeps standing. She has been standing her whole life. The house sounds different without her. The hum of the dishwasher is a little louder. The grandfather clock seems to linger between ticks. The air carries the sterile scent of lemon polish, but none of the warmth that used to ride along with it. On the first morning, Martha balances a breakfast tray on her hip. Oatmeal with brown sugar, sliced strawberries, a glass of orange juice with the blue bendy straw he likes, and knocks on Ethan's door. "Sweetheart?" It's Martha. Silence. She nudges the door just enough to slip the tray inside and leave it on the desk. The curtains are drawn, a baseball cap tossed over the lamp to dim the room further. An army of plastic dinosaurs stands guard on the windowsill. The boy-shaped mound under the quilt doesn't stir. "Just gonna set this right here," she says, voice gentle. "I'll check back in a bit." She withdraws, listens a beat, hears nothing but the tray's spoon settle. By noon, the oatmeal has congealed. The strawberries have wept into a pink halo. The juice sweats a ring onto the wood. Martha carries it back down, lips tight, and makes a grilled cheese the way Grace showed her. Low heat, extra butter, press with a spatula until the edges crackle. She places apple slices in a fan and sprinkles cinnamon. She knocks again. "Hey, champ, this one melts in your mouth." The lock clicks this time, just enough to open 2 inches and admit the tray. A pale hand reaches out from shadow, takes it, slides the door shut. 15 minutes later, Martha returns. The sandwich is untouched, the apple browning, the bendy straw is bitten flat. David spends the morning fielding calls he doesn't remember later. A vendor needs a signature. A manager wants an answer on a shipment. The Whitmore Lumber logo on his email feels like someone else's name. He stands in the doorway of his office, watching the lake flash through the south windows, and tells himself this is temporary. Kids read the weather off the adults around them. Once everyone stops dramatizing, the boy will come back to dinner like he always does. He lasted through worse than a staff change. He lasted through. David stops that sentence because it ends with a name he boxed up and took off every wall. By late afternoon, Martha's voice finds him in the library. "Mr. Whitmore?" He looks up from a spreadsheet he's been staring through. Yes, she keeps her tone even, respectful. But there's gravel in it. He hasn't eaten. He'll eat when he's hungry. He hasn't eaten, she repeats. He hasn't spoken. He hasn't opened the drapes. The boy's fading. "Please don't say that. What else would you like me to call it?" Martha folds her hands, knuckles bleached. This isn't a tantrum. David's jaw works. He's 9. He'll survive a hard day. "Grace," he swallows, chooses the safer word. "Miss Turner was blurring lines. You saw how he clung to her. It wasn't healthy." "I saw a child who finally felt seen," Martha answers, quiet but unflinching. "And I saw you take that away." David looks past her at the row of leather-bound volumes he never opens. "He was manipulated," he says, softer. "She stepped into a space I should have." He stops, builds a new sentence. "She made herself indispensable so she could stay." "It happens. It might happen somewhere," Martha says. "That's not what happened here." She leaves before the heat in his face can turn to something he'll regret. That night, the house sighs in its sleep. David sits on the edge of his bed, tie loosened, knuckles pressed to his eyes. He hears footsteps in the hallway. Martha's careful steps. Then the quiet, urgent clatter of a tray set down too fast. He rises and opens his door enough to see her at Ethan's, ear bent close to the wood. "Ethan?" she whispers. "Honey, you okay in there?" There's the smallest sound, like a cough thin as paper. "I'm right here," she says, palm flat to the door. "I'm right here." At dawn, he finds the patio empty, except for the pebbles Ethan pocketed the day before, spilled like loose coins near a chair leg. He crouches and brushes a fingertip over one, the smallest one, the one that fits into the hollow of a 9-year-old's palm. He stands when his phone vibrates. The number is unfamiliar, but the voice is not. "David," Veronica purrs, all honey and silk, the kind of tone that sounds like a solution even before it names a problem. "You've been on my mind." He feels the smallest tightening above his collarbone. "Veronica, I heard there was a scene," she says, letting the last word smile. Poor thing. Children can be so easily swayed, especially when someone with an agenda whispers in their ear. "We're not discussing household staff," he says, sharper than he means to. "But we are discussing your family," she counters, soothing. And someone clearly inserted herself where she shouldn't. I saw the way she lingered, the casual familiarity, very boundary challenged. "She's gone," he says. "It's done." "But is he better?" Veronica asks, and in the silence that follows, she finds an opening. No answer. That tells me no. Which is exactly why you need to reset the narrative. Let's try again, on your terms. No theatrics, no manipulation, just warm, gracious conversation. You set the tone, we follow it. David stares at the lake, a white boat cutting a clean line through the early water. He won't come downstairs. "He will if you expect him to," she says brightly. "He needs boundaries. He needs consistency. He needs to feel you're in charge. We'll make it easy for him. We'll bring a few thoughtful things to break the ice. Not bribery," she adds quickly, anticipating his objection. "Just gestures. This weekend," he says before he can think of a reason to say no. "Perfect," Veronica all but sings. "I'll coordinate with the others. Saturday at 3? And David, don't let the child run the house. It makes them anxious. Be firm. You'll thank me later." After the call, he keeps the phone in his hand like a talisman against doubt. He inventories facts he can live with. He is providing. He is correcting. He is protecting his son from a dependence that isn't sustainable. He hears Grace's name like a note underwater and chooses not to lift his head for air. The second day is worse. Martha opens Ethan's door with the master key after knocking and waiting and knocking again. The room is damp with sleep. He's awake but turned away, knees drawn up, thumb ghosting along the seam of the quilt. She cracks the window an inch to let morning in. Blueberry pancakes, she announces brightly, a voice she once used for her own boys when the world was heavier than their backpacks. I put chocolate chips in 3. Guess which ones? He doesn't guess. He doesn't move. She sets a plate on the dresser and pulls the chair closer to the bed. You don't have to talk, she says, taking her seat, settling in. I can do the talking. When Mr. Whitmore was about your age, he used to sneak down to the lake at night and try to catch a fish with a flashlight. Never caught a thing. Scared them all with the light, I said. She chuckles at the memory she's making up. She didn't know David when he was a boy. But it's a warm sound, something to hang in the air like a string of lights. He swallows. His shoulder jumps like it wants to speak but can't. She keeps telling stories. 3 more. 4. By the time she reaches the last, the pancakes have gone cool. At dinner, David sits at the head of the table and stares at the 2 empty places that used to be filled by voices. He forces down a slice of roast he cannot taste. The house thuds around him, settling in the summer heat. He pictures Saturday like a relief pitcher. He tells himself a do-over will smooth the jagged edges and teach the boy how to move forward. On the 3rd morning, Martha finds the plate from the night before untouched and the glass of milk soured, an ugly film riding its top. She takes everything away, cleans, replaces, knocks, waits. She tries not to think the words that keep tapping on the back of her teeth. She tries hard not to go get Grace's number from the back of her address book. At 11, she goes to the library and doesn't stand in the doorway like Help does. She comes around the desk because she's earned her voice in this house. Sir, David looks up, impatience pinned into a neat shape. Martha, I have a conference call. You have a boy who hasn't eaten solid food in 3 days. He will, he says. We have a plan for Saturday. Her eyes close a second. Saturday is 2 days away. He'll be fine. He won't, she answers, and the 4 letters land like a gavel. He isn't. There's nothing fine about what I'm seeing. You think I don't see? The edge is back in his voice, the business edge that pushes freight cars up hills. I'm doing what I can. I'm doing what I should have done months ago. I'm setting the tone. What tone is that? She asks. Silence? He flinches. She softens because she knows when to push and when to put out a hand. Call her, Martha says. If not for you, for him. He turns away like the lake might let him hide. No, he says. We're not rewarding this. It isn't a performance, she says. It's a broken heart. He waves her out, and when she's gone, he presses his palms hard into his eye sockets until stars burst in the dark. Saturday comes scrubbed in blue, the kind of summer afternoon postcards print. By 2:30, the driveway looks like a dealership lot again. A man unloads a bike from a roof rack, matte black, top of the line, the kind with shocks that would never feel a crack on a suburban sidewalk. A ribbon bows at the handlebars. Another guest steps out in a white sundress, carrying a shopping bag with a label David recognizes from Fifth Avenue, tissue paper peeking like expensive clouds. Veronica arrives last with a grin and a box the size of a small treasure chest. The edges taped like she can't wait to be thanked for whatever hums inside. The staff has polished every visible surface. The dining room table gleams. Flowers in tall vases arch like swans. There is a platter of cookies no one will touch. The house smells like lilies and furniture oil and the high, sharp note of new plastic. Martha moves through it all like a reluctant stagehand, wishing she could dim the lights and lower a curtain. David checks his watch. Checks it again. He turns to Martha. Bring him down, he says. Tell him I'm asking, not suggesting. Martha nods once, lips thin, and climbs the stairs like she's headed into a weather system. She knocks, then opens the door. It takes a long minute. Ethan sits on the floor by the bed, back against the frame, eyes on nothing. He's still in the same t-shirt from yesterday. He's smaller some way that isn't measurable. The room's air is stale. Martha kneels so she isn't tall. Hey, baby, your dad wants you downstairs. Just to say hello. He lifts his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time in 3 days he speaks. The word rough, unused. Is Grace here? Martha's eyes shine. She shakes her head. No, honey. He drops his gaze. Then I don't want to go. I know, she whispers. I know you don't. But he's not asking. She reaches out, pats his knee. How about I go with you? I'll be right there. He rubs the heel of his hand under his nose. He hauls himself up like the floor's made of mud. He puts on socks, then pulls them off because they feel wrong, then leaves them off. On the way out, he grabs something from the dresser drawer, a small, worn teddy bear that once lived in a shoebox under the bed and has lately moved closer to the pillow. I'll carry him, Martha offers. I got it, he says, voice no louder than the sound a page makes when it turns. They descend. On the landing, the house's murmur grows, the clink of ice in a glass, a laugh tuned to impress, the cadence of women who know how to fill a room with their version of kindness. Ethan pauses at the top of the last staircase and looks down into a stage set he never auditioned for. He feels Martha's hand hover at his back, not pushing, just promising. He steps into the light. The women returned on a Saturday afternoon, their cars rolling up the long driveway like a parade of wealth and confidence. Engines quieted, doors opened, and heels clicked against the stone path leading into the Whitmore house. Each carried something glossy or oversized. Stacked boxes wrapped in metallic paper, bikes with bows tied across the handlebars, sleek shopping bags with designer names spelled in gold. Their voices overlapped in a chorus of practiced charm, bright and hollow as the spring sun above them. Inside, Martha prepared the living room, though her face betrayed no enthusiasm. She had polished the coffee table, arranged flowers in the vase, and set out a tray of lemonade, but her eyes darted constantly toward the staircase. She knew Ethan hadn't come down all morning. When she heard the front door open and the wave of perfume drift in, she clenched the dishcloth in her hands until it left damp creases across her palms. David stepped forward in his pressed suit, shoulders square, jaw rigid. He welcomed the women with the sort of smile a man uses to cover his unease. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward the parlor. "It means a lot." Veronica entered last, her presence commanding the room. She wore a silk blouse the color of champagne, her earrings swinging with deliberate sparkle. She rested a manicured hand briefly on David's arm. "We wouldn't miss it," she purred, as though this gathering were a social event rather than a test of a grieving child's heart. The women spread their gifts across the room, setting them on the rug until the space looked like a holiday morning. Shiny consoles, glittering watches, crisp shirts, shoes still padded with tissue, gadgets stacked like trophies. Finally, Martha coaxed Ethan down the staircase. He descended slowly, shoulders curved inward, hair falling in his eyes. He looked smaller than usual, wrapped in a faded sweatshirt, clutching his worn teddy bear like it was the only solid thing left in his life. His bare feet whispered against the wood, every head turned toward him. Their smiles widened, almost rehearsed. Veronica crouched low, balancing on her designer heels, and extended a rectangular box wrapped in silver foil. "For you, sweetheart," she said warmly, too warmly. I remembered how much boys your age love these. She revealed the latest gaming console, its plastic sheen catching the chandelier's light. Another woman wheeled forward a glossy black bicycle with a crimson bow. Another set down a box with expensive sneakers inside. Another offered noise-canceling headphones. "We thought you might like choices," one of them said, her voice lilting. Ethan stopped at the edge of the rug, staring at the mountain of gifts. His teddy bear sagged against his chest. He didn't step closer, didn't reach out. His voice, when it came, was fragile and dry, like paper crumbling. "Where's Grace?" The room stiffened. No one answered. David blinked, his throat tight. The women glanced at each other, confusion flitting across their perfectly made-up faces. Veronica straightened, her smile faltering, before she forced it back again. Ethan let the silence stretch, his eyes scanning them. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, voice rising just enough to carry through the parlor. "You don't know me." The words fell heavy. A nervous laugh broke from one of the women, but no one joined her. "You don't know my favorite color," Ethan continued, his tone steady now, sharper with every sentence. "You don't know what I eat when I can't sleep. You don't know what happens when I wake up screaming in the middle of the night." His lips trembled, but his gaze didn't waver. Grace did. The silence that followed was not polite. It was raw, exposed. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. One woman tried to salvage the moment. "Ethan, that's just because we haven't had time yet. We could." "No," he cut her off, his voice small but certain. "You're not here for me. You're here for him. His eyes flicked toward David, then dropped again to the bear in his lap. The pile of gifts glared from the floor, untouched, absurdly bright against the dullness of the boy's skin. His cheeks had grown pale, his frame thinner over the past 3 days, as though he were shrinking from the inside out. David's jaw clenched. His chest ached with a mixture he couldn't name: shame, frustration, fear. The gaze of the women burned into him, waiting for his reaction. But Ethan spoke again, so softly that they had to lean forward to hear. "Grace saw me," he whispered. Not the rest of this. A hush blanketed the room. Veronica cleared her throat, smoothed her blouse, and forced another smile. "Children say dramatic things," she said lightly, as though brushing away a speck of dust. But her tone wavered, her poise cracking around the edges. David exhaled hard through his nose, a sound halfway between control and collapse. He turned toward Ethan, searching for something to say, but the boy had already curled inward, face pressed into the bear's fur. Martha moved closer, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Her voice trembled with conviction as she looked at David. "This isn't working," she said quietly, but firmly. "He doesn't need more presence. He needs her." David didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes swept over the useless mountain of luxury gifts, then over his son's small, bent frame. The truth pressed against him from all sides, but pride held it locked inside. Outside, the lake slapped against the shore, loud in the silence of the parlor. Inside, the boy who had once been bright and laughing seemed to vanish a little more into himself, while the adults shifted awkwardly, exposed by a child who had spoken the only truth in the room. The week dragged on like a storm cloud hanging over the Whitmore house. Ethan had stopped coming downstairs altogether. The meals Martha left outside his door returned untouched, the juice glasses still full, the apples browned. The boy who once carried his bear into every room now clutched it in bed like a lifeline. His eyes hollowed, his skin dulled, and silence became his only language. Martha worried openly. Each day she pressed David harder, her voice steadier, though her heart trembled. "This isn't sulking, David," she warned one morning, standing in the kitchen with her apron still dusted in flour. "He's slipping away. This boy doesn't just miss her. He's fading because she's gone." David waved her words aside with a stiff hand, eyes fixed on the ledger spread across the counter. He drowned himself in numbers and meetings, anything to avoid the image of his son's closed door. "He'll come around," he muttered. "He has to." But even as he said it, he felt the hollowness of his own voice. It was on the 7th day that Martha found him. She had knocked softly at first, whispering his name. When no answer came, she pushed the door open and felt her chest clench at the sight. The bathroom door stood ajar. Inside, Ethan lay crumpled on the cold tile, the teddy bear limp beside him. His lips were pale, his breath shallow, his sweatshirt soaked in sweat. Martha fell to her knees. "Ethan!" Her cry cracked through the silence. She gathered his fragile frame into her arms, trembling as if holding glass. His head lolled weakly against her chest, and she screamed for David. David thundered up the stairs, his face blanching when he saw. "Call the doctor!" Martha shouted. "Now!" Within the hour, Dr. Alan Pierce arrived, his black bag in hand, his expression grim. He was a tall man in his 50s, weathered by decades of rural practice, the kind of physician who spoke plainly because sugarcoating never saved lives. He knelt beside the boy, checked his pulse, his eyes, his weight with clinical precision, then rose slowly, his jaw tight. "Severe dehydration," he said flatly, "malnutrition, and a dangerous level of depression in a child this age." He glanced at David, and his eyes burned with accusation. "Mr. Whitmore, your son isn't sick from food or water. He's sick from grief. He's dying of sadness." The words struck like a hammer. David blinked, his lips parting, the air stolen from his lungs. Dr. Pierce didn't soften his tone. "You took away the one person who made him feel safe, and now he's punishing himself for it. He doesn't believe there's a reason left to live." Martha's hand flew to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. David staggered back against the wall, his confident facade cracking, splintering. He wanted to protest, to argue that Grace had manipulated Ethan until poisoned his mind. But the sight of his son, limp and lifeless on the bed, destroyed every word before it could leave his tongue. For the first time in years, David Whitmore felt powerless. Night fell heavy over the house. David sat in his study with the curtains drawn, the decanter untouched, his hands clasped uselessly on the desk. Upstairs, Ethan stirred only faintly under Martha's watch, drifting in and out of restless sleep. The doorbell rang close to midnight. Its echo startled the silence, sharp and unwelcome. David rose, his footsteps echoing down the hall. When he opened the door, Veronica stood framed by the porch light, two leather suitcases at her side. "David," she said sweetly, stepping forward without invitation. "I couldn't sleep knowing what you're going through. You shouldn't face this alone." He blinked, startled. "Veronica, I've made up my mind." She brushed past him, dragging her bags inside. "You need help. I'm staying." David, too weary to argue, let the words hang in the air. His shoulders sagged as he closed the door, unsure whether he had just gained support or let in another storm. Veronica wasted no time. She climbed the staircase, her heels sharp against the wood, and found Ethan's room. Martha tried to intercept, whispering, "He needs rest." But Veronica swept past, her perfume invading the space like smoke. She perched on the edge of Ethan's bed, her voice honeyed yet laced with command. "Listen to me, young man. I know you're upset, but life moves on. Grace was never right for you or your father. She only wanted his money, and I won't let you be fooled." Ethan's eyes fluttered open, glazed but burning faintly with rage. His voice cracked, but the words were sharp. "You don't talk about her." Veronica arched a brow. "I'm only telling you the truth. She doesn't care about you the way we do." "She? Stop." Ethan's voice tore through the room, startling even Martha. He pushed himself up, his body frail but his spirit blazing. "You don't know her. She cared about me more than anyone ever did. She's the only one who ever saw me." The heat of his defense stung Veronica's pride. Her smile slipped, her face twisting with sudden cruelty. Before anyone could move, she raised her hand and struck his cheek. The crack of the slap echoed, brutal and final. Martha gasped, rushing forward, but Ethan was already moving. His eyes wide with shock, his skin flushed red where her palm had landed. He stumbled off the bed and bolted out the door. His feet pounded against the stairs as he descended, his voice rising in a cry that split the midnight stillness. "She hit me." David shot to his feet from the study, his face pale as Ethan barreled into the room. The boy's cheek blazed crimson, his small chest heaving with fury and pain. "She hit me, Dad," he shouted again, tears finally spilling. David's eyes snapped to the staircase where Veronica appeared, flustered, her blouse rumpled, her earrings swaying. She opened her mouth, but David's hand shot up like a command. "Enough." His voice boomed, the authority that once built empires, now weaponized in defense of his son. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Ethan and Veronica. His glare carried a fury she had never seen in him before. "You're finished here." His words cut through the air. "Get out of my house." Veronica froze, her painted lips parting in disbelief. "David, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." His voice broke, not with weakness, but with grief. "I let you into my home, into my son's life, and you raised your hand against him. There is nothing left to say. Pack your things and go." Ethan clung to his father's sleeve, still trembling. Martha appeared behind, her face set with vindication, as though justice had finally cracked through the walls of the mansion. Veronica's eyes flickered, calculating, but she saw no give in David's stance. Slowly, with a bitter scoff, she turned, grabbed her suitcases, and descended the stairs without another word. The door slammed behind her, leaving silence in her wake. David looked down at Ethan, his heart breaking at the sight of the boy's wet eyes and trembling frame. For the first time, he drew his son into his arms, holding him as if to shield him from the very world he himself had unleashed. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Ethan's hair, his voice raw. "I'm so sorry." And in that fragile moment, the man who had believed money could mend any wound understood just how much it had cost him to be wrong. The house was heavy with silence that night, a silence that pressed against the walls like a second skin. Upstairs, Ethan slept fitfully, his breathing uneven, his small hands curled tight around the bear that had begun to look ragged and thin from constant clutching. David stood in the doorway of his son's room, hesitant, uncertain of his own right to enter. For years, he had walked into boardrooms without fear, faced down rivals with steel in his gaze. But now, standing on the threshold of his boy's suffering, he felt like a coward. He finally stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic from Dr. Pierce's visit, mixed with the soft, lingering scent of the stuffed animal's fur. David pulled up the chair beside the bed and sat. He watched Ethan's chest rise and fall, the boy's cheeks pale, his lips dry. It struck him like a knife. This was not stubbornness, not rebellion. This was pain that had outgrown words. After a long while, Ethan stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, and his gaze met his father's. For a moment, David expected the usual silence, the wall his son had built between them. But tonight, something shifted. Ethan's voice came out hoarse, fragile but steady. "You don't know what it's been like," he whispered. David leaned closer, his throat tightening. "Tell me." Ethan's eyes glistened. "Since Mom died, it's like you disappeared too. You were here, but not really. You filled the house with strangers. You made it so loud I couldn't even hear myself think. But none of them cared about me. Not really. And you..." His lip trembled, but he pressed on. "You left me alone in this house full of people. Do you know how lonely that feels? To have everyone around you, but still no one?" Each word carved itself into David's chest. He didn't defend himself. For the first time, he didn't interrupt. He listened, truly listened. "I tried to be okay," Ethan continued, his voice breaking. "I tried to pretend like it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered every day. Grace, she saw me. She sat with me, listened to me, even when I didn't say anything. She knew why I had nightmares. She knew what I liked to eat, the songs Mom used to sing. She remembered everything I thought everyone forgot." He paused, swallowing hard. "When you took her away, you took away the only person left who made me feel like I wasn't invisible." David's hand trembled on the edge of the blanket. His heart hammered with guilt so sharp it made him dizzy. All the wealth, the power, the walls he had built around himself, they meant nothing against the truth of his son's pain. "I failed you," he whispered, voice raw. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought..." He stopped, shaking his head. "No, I was protecting myself. From my grief, from facing what we lost, and I let you suffer because of it." For a long time, the room held only the sound of Ethan's breathing, slow and shallow, the night stretching around them like a fragile cocoon. Then David reached out, carefully, almost afraid of being rejected. His hand rested on his son's small fingers. Ethan didn't pull away. That single gesture broke something open inside him, a crack of forgiveness, faint but real. David stayed there until Ethan drifted back into sleep. He kept his hand on the boys, watching the rise and fall of his chest, vowing silently that he would never again leave him in the shadows. The dawn came pale and cold, sunlight slanting through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. Martha moved quietly through the kitchen, her movements brisk but her face lined with worry. When David entered, she looked up, surprised by the weariness in his eyes. He seemed older than the night before, stripped of his armor. "I need her address," he said simply. Martha set down the spoon in her hand, studying him for a long moment. "Grace?" He nodded. "I was wrong. About everything. And Ethan..." His voice broke, and he steadied himself with a deep breath. "He needs her. More than he's ever needed me." For the first time in years, Martha saw humility in David Whitmore. She reached for the notepad tucked beside the phone and scribbled an address. "She's been staying at the guest house on Ashbury Street, number 14. David took the paper, his fingers trembling slightly as he folded it. He left without another word, the heavy doors closing behind him, with a finality that felt almost like penance. The town was quiet in the early morning. Shops hadn't opened yet, and the streets held the chill of dawn. David's sleek car looked out of place as it wound down narrow lanes lined with modest houses. He pulled up in front of a small guest house painted pale blue, the kind of place few would notice unless they were looking for it. A single flowering plant sat in the window, fragile and defiant. He hesitated on the porch, adjusting his cuffs out of habit before realizing how absurd the gesture was here. For once, appearances meant nothing. He knocked. The door opened slowly, and there she was. Grace, her hair pulled back loosely, dressed in a simple sweater, no trace of the mansion's polish around her. She looked surprised, then wary. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully. "David," he corrected softly, almost pleading. His throat tightened as he spoke the words he had rehearsed the entire drive. "I came because I was wrong. About you. About everything. I let my pride blind me, and my son, he's paying the price." His voice cracked, stripped of all pretense. "He's dying inside, Grace, and I don't know how to save him." Her eyes softened, but she didn't move. "And what is it you want from me?" David swallowed hard. "Come back. Not for me. For him. Please." Silence stretched between them, the morning air crisp with hesitation. Grace crossed her arms, steady but wounded. You accused me of things I never did. You made me feel small, disposable. And now you stand here asking me to step back into that? His shoulders sagged. He had no defense. You're right, he admitted, his voice hushed. I was cruel. I was arrogant. But none of that matters anymore. The only thing that matters is Ethan. He needs you, Grace. You're the only person who's been able to reach him. The only one he trusts. If there's anything left in you for him, I beg you, don't let him go through this alone. Grace's eyes glistened. For a moment, she turned away, steadying herself. She thought of Ethan's small hands clutching hers, his fragile smile when she read him stories, the way his eyes lit up when she simply sat beside him. She couldn't abandon that, no matter how much she wanted to protect her own heart. Finally, she nodded. I'll come back. But understand this, David, I'm doing it for him, not for you, not for your house or your wealth, only for Ethan. Relief flooded his face, mingled with shame and gratitude. He bowed his head slightly, humbled in a way he had never known. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. Grace stepped back inside to gather her things. David stood on the porch, staring at the pale blue paint of the guest house, knowing he would never again look at it as just a building. It had become the place where he first learned what it meant to be wrong, and what it meant to love his son enough to admit it. The house had been silent for days, its grand hallways echoing with nothing but the tick of clocks and the occasional creak of wood. Yet on this morning, something stirred. Ethan had stationed himself at the upstairs window before the sun was fully up, perched like a watchman, his forehead pressed against the glass. His body was still thin, his face pale, but his eyes flickered with something Martha hadn't seen in weeks. Hope. He watched the long driveway, every shadow a possibility, every bird taking flight a distraction. His small hands tapped against the window ledge, restless, nervous. He knew his father had gone out early, and though no one told him why, his heart clung to a single desperate wish. The rumble of the car broke the silence first. Ethan's breath caught. He scrambled to his feet, pressing his nose hard against the glass as the sleek sedan rolled up to the front steps. The door opened. His father stepped out, alone. Ethan's chest tightened, his shoulders slumping. A hollow ache rushed through him, deeper than hunger, sharper than thirst. He turned from the window, ready to collapse back into his bed when the front door creaked open. And then he heard her voice. Ethan. His head whipped around. Grace stood in the doorway of the great hall, her figure framed in sunlight, her hair catching the light. She looked both weary and strong, her eyes searching for him the way they always had. Ethan didn't hesitate. He bolted down the stairs, his socks sliding against the polished wood, nearly stumbling in his haste. When he reached her, he launched himself forward, crashing into her arms. She caught him, holding him tight as he buried his face against her shoulder. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but his laughter bubbled up at the same time, wild and unrestrained. Grace clung to him, her own eyes wet, whispering promises he didn't need words to believe. I'm here. I won't let go. From the kitchen doorway, Martha pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Her eyes glistened as she whispered to herself. This house has been dead without you. The days that followed shifted like seasons breaking. The air grew lighter, warmer, even though it was still winter outside. Ethan's appetite returned. Tentatively at first, a spoonful here, a bite there. But soon he was asking for pancakes in the morning, sneaking cookies in the afternoon, laughing when Martha caught him. His color returned, his laughter bouncing off the tall ceilings in echoes the house had long forgotten. Grace's presence threaded through everything. She sat with Ethan in the afternoons, coaxing him gently into conversations about his mother. At first, he resisted. Talking about her hurt too much, made the loss fresh again. But Grace had a way of softening it, of showing him that remembering wasn't a weakness. It was a way of keeping love alive. Together, they pulled out old photo albums. Ethan pointed to his favorite pictures, telling stories about family picnics, about bedtime songs, about the way his mother braided his hair once for fun. Grace listened as if every detail mattered, as if every memory was sacred. David watched from the doorway more than once, unseen. His chest ached at the sight. For years he had tried to bury the memory of his late wife, believing silence was strength, that forgetting would protect him. But now, watching his son smile through tears, watching Grace hold the memories up like fragile treasures instead of painful weights, he realized how wrong he'd been. Grace wasn't trying to replace his wife. She was helping Ethan keep her memory alive. She was showing him that grief and joy could live side by side. At dinner one evening, Ethan surprised them both. He had been unusually quiet through the meal, pushing peas around his plate, eyes darting between his father and Grace. Then, without warning, he put his fork down and asked the question that hung in the air like thunder. "Dad, do you like Grace as a mom?" The words stopped David mid-breath. Grace's eyes widened, the color rushing to her cheeks. The boy's voice was steady, not shy, not joking. It was the earnest curiosity of a child who had carried too much, who longed for answers. David looked at his son, then at Grace. She met his gaze, her expression caught between shock and tenderness. For a long, fragile moment, the room was suspended in silence. Ethan waited, his eyes shining with the vulnerability only children can carry. "Because I think maybe we should be a family. Officially." David's throat tightened. His chest ached with the weight of all that had been lost and all that was being offered in this single moment. Grace's hand trembled where it rested on the table, and when David's eyes met hers, he saw the same mix of fear, hope, and love mirrored back. No one answered right away. They didn't need to. The look between David and Grace was enough. The seed had been planted, and in Ethan's words, a future had begun to take root. The garden looked smaller than it did in the hardest days, the way places shrink when fear drains out of them. White chairs arc toward a simple wooden arch wrapped in eucalyptus and pale roses. The lake flashes in the distance like a promise kept, under the same pair of maples where a boy once stood and chose a housekeeper over a parade of perfection. A narrow aisle waits. Martha smooths a tablecloth for the lemonade stand she insisted on setting herself. Dr. Pierce lingers at the back, chuckling with a neighbor, hands in his jacket pockets like a man satisfied to have been proven wrong about nothing and right about everything that mattered. Ethan tugs at his little suit jacket, the kind with a pocket square that keeps trying to escape. He checks the ring pillow for the 5th time and then the 6th, pretending he doesn't see Martha watching him with eyes that shine. When the string quartet lifts its first bright note, he glances toward the house, heart beating quick, and catches sight of his dad. David stands on the flagstone, straight-backed and human in a way he never let himself be before. The tie is perfect. The smile isn't. It wobbles. It's better that way. Grace appears at the French doors in a simple ivory dress that seems to have been stitched out of daylight. Her hair is pinned back with a sprig of baby's breath. She holds a bouquet and something else you can't hold. The years that made her gentle, the days that taught her to stay. For a second she pauses, eyes taking in the garden, the faces, the maples, the footbridge at the very back like a memory made of wood. She inhales, and the whole house seems to exhale with her. The procession begins. 2 flower girls throw petals like confetti from their small fists. Ethan waits, still as a soldier, then steps into the aisle with the rings balanced on white satin. He walks carefully but grins anyway, because it's impossible not to. People laugh softly. There's something about a grin that makes everyone else remember how. When he reaches the arch, he takes his place, glancing up at David, who winks like they're sharing a secret no one else has earned. Grace reaches the aisle on Martha's arm. Halfway down, she locks eyes with Ethan. He mouths, "You look awesome," because he couldn't hold that in, even if he tried. She laughs. Tears already starting and keeps coming. The officiant, someone from town who knows everyone's middle name, speaks words about seasons and second chances, about how love is not a substitute teacher, but a new chapter in the same book. David and Grace face each other, hands linked, vows spoken not like lines but like decisions. He promises not to run from the hard parts. She promises to tell the truth when silence would be easier. They both promise to keep the memory of a woman they loved like a lamp in the window, never blown out, always guiding. Ethan lifts the pillow toward them, solemn as a knight. David slips a ring onto Grace's finger. Grace's hand trembles when she slides one onto his. For a flicker of time, everything is quiet enough to hear the lake against the shore and the soft wind moving the leaves. "You may kiss," the officiant says, and they do, hesitant only in respect, sure in everything else. People clap, someone whistles. The string quartet tumbles into something joyful. Ethan spins around to the guests with both arms flung wide and announces, full-throated, "Now, I've got the best family in the world." Laughter breaks like sunshine. David pulls Ethan into the embrace, and Grace leans in, and for a second they're just three heads pressed together under the maple shade. Cameras click, but the moment keeps something for itself. The private relief of a boy who chose with his heart and was right, the steadiness of a woman who came back for love that wasn't hers and found that it was, the humility of a man who learned to stay when staying was the bravest thing. Thank you so much for watching today's story. If it touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs a little light, and leave your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of inspiration from Cracks of Light. Until next time, keep shining.